Hello, hello. Welcome to Christmas in July. My name is Christina Werner, and I'm going to walk you through this entire release from Colorado Craft Company, and then we're going to get into some cards using some of these stamp sets. This is an amazing holiday release from Colorado Craft Company, and there's a little bit of everything, or I should say, a little bit of something for everyone in this release. First, we've got these two cute little stamp sets. One's called North Pole, and the other is Happy Feet. And then we've got this fun typographic one called Quick Cards Small. You've got three large blocks of greetings, and then you have Happy Holidays at the bottom. I'll be using that really, really tall one on a card today. This one right here, I believe is called Joy Ornaments, and you can make the word joy and have the O in joy be one of the ornaments. Kind of a fun idea. This one's Quick Cards Large, and you've got some examples of how you can arrange all of these words. It's on the back of the packaging. I'll be using this one today as well. And then we've got this one called Spirit of Christmas, and you have some really large kind of handwritten words and some other typography you can put with it. We've got two new stamp sets from Anita Jerem. One is called Christmas Hats and the other is All is Bright. I'll be using both of these stamp sets for a card today. I'm going to use elements, a lot of elements from this one, Christmas Hats. And then I'm going to use just the cute little kitty that's on this one. I'm going to be using it along with all the other critters, and we're going to put those all on one card. We've also got this fun one called Chillin' Nomies. Some cute kind of North Pole images with a sleigh. And then all of these images, or most of these images, are also repeated on the Sweater Weather stamp set. You've got those cute characters and a few additions on these sweaters that you can color and kind of make your own. The last stamp set is this really large one called Pine Swag, and it has this it almost looks like it could be mistletoe, but it's not. It's just like a big pine arrangement, and it's one of their oversized stamp sets. Okay, so we're going to go right into the cards today. I've got three cards here at the beginning that all have watercolor backgrounds, just different ways of using watercolor, and I'm using Distress Reinkers. And then I'm going to get into one where I'm coloring some critters. So for this first card here, I wanted to arrange the stamp set in the phrase that I wanted for my card. So I've pre-stamped it just as a map, so I can have that in the back of my mind while I paint. I'm going to be using some watercolor paper here. This is from Fabriano, and this is their Artistico Extra White. It's pre-cut to 5x7, and I'm tearing off the bottom end because I'm going to be doing sort of a faux dip dye look for this first background. Now, it's not going to be entirely a faux dip dye look, because if it really was a dip dye, you would basically have very pale colors at the top, and then it would get more intense at the bottom. But I'm going to be painting a little bit different. I'm going to be using, you're seeing four colors on screen here, but I'm actually only going to use three. I'm going to use Festive Berries, Spun Sugar, and Evergreen Bough. I decided not to use Rustic Wilderness because Evergreen Bough was enough green for what I was doing. So I've put a droplet of each color out on this palette, and I'm going to be picking up the colors with a damp brush and then applying it to my watercolor paper. I'm starting near the top edge, and I want a really diluted color, very pale pink up at the top, and then I'm going to dry that. I'm going to be drying the watercolor paper in between every single layer of color. So now I've got a little bit more color on my brush, a little bit more of that spun sugar, and then I'm going to dry it. And next I'm going to get even more of that color, add more of that color on, add a stripe, and I'm coming down and pulling the color more to the center of the watercolor paper. And then once again, I'm going to hit that with my heat tool. So now I'm going to go into a little bit of that Festive Berries. I'm going to water it down just a little bit so it's not quite so intense. And then I'm going to bring that stripe in. All right, so I'm going to dry that again. And then I'm going to come in with even stronger red. So I'm just going to add a little tiny bit of water to this. It's mostly just all of that reinker pigment. And I'm going to pull that down more into the center. Now I'm going to start transitioning to the evergreen bough color now. So after I dry that stripe of red, I'm going to bring just a little bit of that evergreen bough up to the festive berries and mix that in. These colors, when they're mixed together, create almost like a purple shade. So I'm going to have a purple transition area in the center. So it's going to get pretty dark and intense before I transition all the way to the evergreen bough. I've got a little more of that evergreen bough in my mix, and I'm going to bring that down toward the bottom. And you can see it sort of turns a purpley gray. I'll dry this once again. And then on this next color, where I'm using mostly all evergreen bough, it's going to start looking like a green color again. So I'm going to bring it down a little bit, dry that. And then I'm going to come in with even more of that evergreen bough shade. And now it's really intensifying to that green. And then I'm going to try to dilute the color a little bit and go to a more pale version of that evergreen bough at the very bottom. Now this is where that torn edge comes into play. You really want to saturate that torn edge with as much color as possible. I'm just going to darken that up just a tiny bit, and then I'll hit that with my heat tool. I really love this transition from pink to red to a green color. I think it's really, really pretty. It's going to be a great background for my big, huge stamped greeting. So before we get into my big, huge stamped greeting, I'm going to create another background for my second card. Now, before I get into the painting, I'm actually going to stamp this really long greeting. This is from, I think it was the Quick Card Small. And this is going to go right in the center of this 5x7 watercolor paper. I'm stamping it in antique linen distress ink, so it's actually going to get lost once I start watercoloring my background because the water will reactivate the ink and move it around. But I just wanted to kind of get an idea of where the words would be so I can plan where these dark, intense areas of colors would end up. So I'm coming in and just dropping in patches of color. I did a little bit of the spun sugar, but I realized that that pale pink kind of got lost anyway. So it's mostly going to be festive berries and evergreen bough running the show here. So I've got festive berries, a little bit of water on my brush to kind of spread it out. And then as I bring in this evergreen bough, I'm going to let the colors overlap just a little bit, but I don't want to let them overlap too much because as we learned on the last background, wherever these colors meet, you're going to get some intense dark purple shades. And I don't want those to overwhelm this entire background. So I'm going to be doing one layer of these colors, and then I'm going to dry it and then come in with another layer just to intensify the colors and get some different variations. So at this point, I used my heat tool just to stop those colors from moving. And now I'm going to come in with some additional color. I put a little bit more of that evergreen bough onto my palette since I was running out of that color. And now I'm going to come in and paint right over the top. I'm using kind of swishing motions, almost like painting a really crazy cloud, and I'm overlapping these colors. I really love to do backgrounds like this where you've got an underlayer of color and then you have a more intense color on top, and you can have kind of these swirls and puff shapes. I think it gives a really, really cool abstract background. And I'm making sure I don't overlap these colors too much. I'm going to come in and drop some additional areas kind of in the center, trying to get the colors to overlap a little bit more, bring in a little bit more of that green shade. But once I got to about this point where I had a little bit of that darker color right there in the center, see how I'm adding a little more dark areas, I decided I better stop there, and I brought my heat tool to it and dried it completely. I wanted it to be bone dry because I'm going to be doing some heat embossing right on top. So I removed my watercolor panel from the hardboard, and then I'm going to give this a quick test with some embossing powder. Like I said, we don't want any like wet areas that could make the powder stick. We want it to be completely bone dry. So this one looked pretty dry. I dusted off all of that embossing powder that I used during my test run, and now I'm going to stamp that greeting again. Now I'm stamping it right now because I left it in the door of my Misty, so I can't go back to that first background yet and stamp it because I need to stamp this one first. So I'm going to stamp it in some Versamark ink, which is a great ink for heat embossing because it stays sticky for a really long time. So I'm stamping this twice without moving anything in my Misty so that I can have a perfect impression. And I'm also going to have it fill in those gaps in the very textured watercolor paper. I then used some gilded embossing powder from Brutus Monroe. This is my favorite gold embossing powder by far. I love that it's not too yellow or too orange. It's a very more of a neutral gold shade once you have it melted. So I'm hitting this with my heat tool, and I'm moving the heat tool as soon as I see that the color has changed and it has that metallic finish. I don't want to overheat this because embossing powder can melt into watercolor paper if you overheat it. So as soon as it melts, I move on. Clean off a little bit of that powder that was sticking to the sides, and then I'll set that aside, and I'm going to come back to my first background. I use the A7 layers dies from Waffle Flower to cut out this piece so that it's the perfect size for an A7 card. And then I use the same die on that second background just to get it all nice and squared up. So I'm going to finish up this second card here before moving on. And I decided what would make it really stand out is adding a gold border around that greeting. So I use the A7 thin frames dies from Simon Says Stamp just to cut out this frame. It wasn't quite the right dimension for my greeting, so I did cut down that frame and then glued it with some liquid glue right down onto the front. After I did that, I wanted to square up the sides a little bit more so that it matched exactly where I had that frame. So I used a T-square ruler and a craft knife just to clean up those edges. But it did make it not quite the perfect dimensions for a 5x7 card. So after I adhered this watercolor panel to my 5x7 card base, I realized it was just a little bit off. So I adhered it kind of nestled over to the left side of my card base. And then I used a T-square ruler and a knife to trim off the right edge so that it was a little bit more centered on the card. So this actually ended up being about 5 1/4 wide, or I'm sorry, 4 3/4 wide by 7. All right, going back to that faux dip die background, now we're going to create that same stacked greeting arrangement that I made for my little map at the beginning of the video. So I'm placing it right in there, and I'm going to start by stamping the word Mary. I mostly just wanted to have a guide for where to place these stamps on my background. So now that I know where that Mary is going to be, I can transfer that to the door of my Misty and then stamp that in some Versamark ink. I'm going to be heat embossing all of these gradings in the same gold embossing powder that I used on the previous card. And because this is watercolor paper and it's more textured, I'll be stamping each one of these twice so that I have a really solid impression and the embossing powder will stick to all of the areas on my grading. Actually, it looks like I stamped this one 3 times. So 3 times for this one. And then I applied my gold embossing powder. There were some areas where this embossing powder really wanted to stick, so I did clean those up with a dry brush, just brush that embossing powder away, and then it was ready to heat set or melt with my heat tool. So like I said before, as soon as you see that powder melt, move your heat tool along. I was then able to arrange the other 3 stamps nestled around that Mary, and then I stamped the rest of the gradings in that same Versamark ink, making sure to kind of move my fingertips over each area of the stamps. I applied the embossing powder and then melted the embossing powder with my heat tool. All right, so you notice that I stamped this greeting off to the left side. So I'm going to trim this up here and make it just a little bit smaller so that it can be on a card and have it perfectly centered. So I've cut that down and I'm going to place it over my 5x7 card base, and I'm going to trim off the end of that card base so that it's smaller. This ended up being about 5.5 by 5. Put some foam tape on the back of that watercolor panel, and I'm going to place that directly onto my card base. And that finishes my second card. So we're going to head right into my third card using a watercolor background. And we're going to start by doing a very faint underlayer of color. I'm using my Distress sprayer to wet that entire surface. And then I'm coming in with that Evergreen Bough shade. I'm using the same colors that I was using before. And I'm just bringing that color in. I've then got a little bit of that spun sugar diluted so it's very, very pale. I'm going to be painting some leaves and berries on top of this, so I don't want any really intense color. I want it to be pretty faded back. So now I'm going to come in and paint some really simple leaves. I'm using the Evergreen Bough shade for all of these. And basically what I'm doing is using like a push-pull method with my brush, where I push down on that brush and it fans out, making the fatter area of each leaf. I love painting leaves like this, and this is somewhat of a more advanced technique, but still simple enough that I think most people could paint some simple leaves like this. But if you're not ready to dive in and paint lots of leaves like this, look through your stash, see if you have any leaf stamps that you could use for this, and you could just stamp them in the Evergreen Bough Distress ink instead of painting them. Or you could even use that very large Pine Swag stamp from this release. You could have that in the background here. I think that would work really, really well also. So I've diluted that color even more for a more faint leaf in the background. And then I'm painting additional leaves on top. Basically what I want to do is have an area of leaves and berries that cover like the top half of my card. I'm going to be stamping the large Joy ornament stamps right over top. And so I just wanted a little bit of a festive background, but I didn't want it to be obvious with holly leaves or more winter type leaves. I wanted them to be a little bit more tropical almost. So after I painted all of those leaves, I came in with some of that festive berries with a very small brush and added berries. I thought that was very apt for painting berries to use the festive berries color. So I'm going to use a little bit of water in the palm of my hand to spritz on some water droplets and then use my paper towel to pick them up. That gives a little bit of interest. And then I grabbed some white gouache and splattered on a little bit of that white gouache. It almost looks like snow to me. And after it's dry, it kind of fades back and adds a lot of texture onto this background. So after the background was completely painted, I then placed this watercolor panel into my MISTI and I stamped the very, very large Joy ornament. I have the J, the ornament, and the Y already in my MISTI, and I'm going to put some Versamark ink all over these stamps, ink them up really, really well, and then I can swing over the door of my MISTI and stamp down onto that watercolor paper. And like I've done in the previous cards for stamping and heat embossing on watercolor paper, I will be stamping this multiple times to make sure I have a really, really solid impression. Walking my fingertips over those stamps, and then I'm going to sprinkle on some gold embossing powder. So this is a really, really large ornament stamp. I think it's absolutely gorgeous. And if you don't want to make a really large card, maybe you want to do an A2 sized card, you could stamp just one of the ornaments, the circle ornament or star, any of the ones that are in the stamp set, and then maybe stamp a smaller greeting and put it right over the center of that ornament. I think that's a great way to use these larger stamps on a smaller card. Now I've got a piece of red cardstock here. I've got it in my MISTI, and I'm going to stamp the To the World greeting so I can finish off that whole sentiment, and that's from that same stamp set. I'm prepping that area with an anti-static powder tool, and then I'm stamping the greeting in Versamark ink. I'm going to sprinkle on some of that gold embossing powder, And then I'll hit this with my heat tool until it's smooth and melted. You can really see those colors change right on top of this red surface. So I trimmed that down and I used my little tiny scissors to cut little V-shaped ribbon ends on each end of this Joy to the World. I then put some foam adhesive on the back of my watercolor panel and I placed that down onto the card base. I put some foam adhesive on the back of my banner and I'm going to put that directly below the Joy stamps that are on my card. Okay, so this is finishing up my first 3 cards for this release. This was going to be just a video all by itself, but then I decided that I wanted to create a 4th card using some of those cute critter stamps. So we're going to take a quick look at how these first 3 cards turned out. I think they look absolutely beautiful with all of that gold embossing on top. They look very, very festive. And I think it's a great addition to my Christmas card stash. So now we're going to go in and use these really cute Anita Jerem stamps. And I was loving all of the little critters, so I decided that I would stamp all of the critters from Christmas Hats plus the cat from All Is Bright. Have that same watercolor paper from Fabriano in my Misty, and I'm going to stamp all of these critters in Antique Linen Distress ink. I'm going to be doing some no-line watercoloring with all of these critters, and Antique Linen is a nice pale ink that works great for this. So after I had all of them stamped, I started painting with distress inks. And my favorite method for painting with distress inks like this is to use a slick surface like this palette I have off to the side. And I just smush each one of these mini ink pads down onto that surface and then pick up some of that ink with a damp paintbrush. I'm using, I think it's a size 0 or maybe a size 2 round brush for all of these animals because they are quite small. And I'm adding a darker edge with that color and then re-wetting my brush and pulling that color in from the edge. I'm going to speed up the video process so you can watch me paint and cut these out. I'm also going to add a few little details with colored pencils. And here we go. Okay, so all of the critters are cut out we're going to speed through the rest of this card creation because it does come together quite quickly. I've created a slimline card base. This is actually a little bit taller than regular slimline. I think I made this 4 inches tall by 8.5 wide. And then I'm using the Spirit of Christmas stamp set from the release, and I'm stamping the greeting off to the side. So it says, wishing you a very happy holiday. And then from that critter stamp set, there's a line that says, from all of us. And I thought that would be perfect to go along for this very large grouping of animals. So I added that greeting down below. And then I'm going to go back to all the animals, and I'm going to arrange them on the front of the card with some foam adhesive, some in front, some in back, just kind of getting them on there in different areas. And then I decided to add some die cut snowflakes. So these are some die cut snowflakes from Simon Says Stamp. And I just used some glitter paper that already had adhesive on the back. I'll have everything linked down below. But I just added those in the background for a little bit of interest, just to finish off the texture of that plain white area in the back. So here's my 4th card for the video. Very different from the first 3. This one is much more detailed, and I hope you enjoyed. Make sure you check out this entire release, all of the stamp sets, over at the Colorado Craft Company shop, and also other retailers where their brand is sold. I'll link to a couple down below if you're looking for some options, but this is available right now at all the usual retailers. Thanks so much for watching today. Make sure you check out the supplies below and let me know in the comments what you're loving from this release. Do you like the critters? Do you like all the typography, all of the sentiments? What is your jam? What are you looking forward to working with? Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys next time.